Practical Apologetics for a Christian Way of Life. The Resurrection of Jesus. Video 1 of 2, Worldviews and Miracles. Suppose someone said to you, there can't be a sufficient evidential case for believing in the resurrection of Jesus because a resurrection would be a miracle. How would you respond? You might like to press pause on the video to have a ponder. In approaching the question of the resurrection of Jesus, it's useful to bear in mind these three topics: the issue of worldview expectations, the need to establish evidence, and the issue of finding the best explanation for that evidence. The statement we just heard relates to the issue of worldview expectations. Here's a relevant quote from New Testament scholar Helen K. Bond in her book, The Historical Jesus, A Guide for the Perplexed. She writes, "Modern academic study of the historical Jesus only really began in the wake of the 18th century Enlightenment, with its rejection of a God who intervenes in history in supernatural ways. The emergence of historical criticism in the 19th century allowed distinctions to be made between the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history, distinctions that have underpinned the quest for the historical Jesus ever since." I have some thoughts in response to this quote. First, it's well worth pointing out that the Enlightenment was not a monolithic anti-God movement. One only has to think of Enlightenment scholars such as Immanuel Kant, John Locke, Isaac Newton, Thomas Reid, Mary Wollstonecraft. The list could be extended. And again, the rejection of a God who intervenes in history in supernatural ways does not allow the distinction between the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history. It requires the distinction, and it does so regardless of the evidence. The modern academic study of the historical Jesus described by Bond is the search for a Jesus consistent with metaphysical naturalism. In a sense, then, the Jesus acknowledged by many atheists and agnostics is a Jesus of faith, an understanding of Jesus shaped by faith in naturalism, rather than a Jesus of history, an understanding of Jesus produced by following the evidence wherever it leads. There are three basic approaches to drawing a line of demarcation between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith, and these approaches can be mixed. First, the metaphysical approach, the idea that miracles can't happen because atheism / naturalism is true. And or secondly, the epistemological approach, the knowledge-focused approach, the idea that miracles can't be known to have happened. And finally, the definitional approach, the idea that miracles can't be mentioned within history as a subject. Let's begin with the metaphysical approach. French atheist Michel Onfray takes this approach when he asserts that we should approach any purportedly holy book from a standpoint hostile to revelation. This is because he assumes the answer to his rhetorical question, who would have done the revealing, is nobody. However, as atheist Lawrence M. Krauss admits, a God who can create the laws of nature can presumably also circumvent them at will. So the key question here is, might God exist? not does God exist. If God might exist, then miracles might happen. Atheist Christopher Hitchens thought that David Hume wrote the last word on the subject of miracles. The 18th century Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume notoriously defined a miracle as a violation of the laws of nature. But as philosopher J.A. Cover points out, miracles are not violations of the laws of nature. The laws describe what objects in nature are capable of producing in light of the powers that they have. And miracles are events not caused by the operation of natural powers in created objects. They're events caused by God. Hume rather gives the game away when he poses the question of why is it more than probable that lead cannot, of itself, remain suspended in the air, unless it be that these events are found agreeable to the laws of nature, and there is required a violation of these laws, or in other words, a miracle, to prevent them. So if God kept some lead suspended in the air, the lead would not remain suspended in the air of itself, but by a special action of divine power. Hume argues thus: a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. Firm and unalterable experience has established these laws. A wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. Therefore, the proof against miracles is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. The hard interpretation of Hume's argument suggests that Hume is arguing like this. 1. Miracles are a violation of the laws of nature. 2. Natural laws are established by unalterable experience. 3. Therefore, miracles are impossible. Hume certainly seems to be arguing this way then when he says that it is a miracle that a dead man should come to life, because that has never been observed. Well, as C.S. Lewis writes in response in his book Miracles, well, we must agree with Hume that if there is absolutely uniform experience against miracles, if, in other words, they have never happened, why, then they never have. Unfortunately, we know the experience against them to be uniform only if we know that all reports of them are false. And we can know all the reports to be false only if we know already that miracles have never occurred. In fact, we are arguing in a circle. Secondly, the epistemological approach. The soft interpretation of Hume's argument suggests that Hume is arguing miracles are unbelievable because we should always believe what's most probable relative to our prior experience. However, as Norman L. Geisler observes, Hume's argument confuses quantity of evidence with the quality of evidence. As philosopher Angus Menuge says, Hume is mistaken in applying the probability of frequency to historical cases. According to Bayes' probability theorem, even if an event initially seems unlikely, new evidence can rationally convince us that the event occurred. atheist Jerry Coyne admits Hume took it too far. No amount of evidence, it seems, could ever override his conviction that miracles were really the result of fraud, ignorance, or misrepresentation. Yet, perhaps there are some events when a miracle is more likely than human error or deception. William Lane Craig notes that the fallaciousness of Hume's reasoning has been recognized by the majority of philosophers writing on the subject today. For good sources to delve deeper into this topic are the books In Defense of Miracles, A Comprehensive Case for God's Action in History, edited by R. Douglas Gevert and Gary R. Habermas, Robert A. Lama's book, The Legitimacy of Miracles, John Earman's book, Hume's Abject Failure, The Argument Against Miracles, and my own book, Getting at Jesus, A Comprehensive Critique of Neo-Atheist Nonsense About the Jesus of History. Last, let's take a look at the definitional approach, that miracles can't be mentioned within history. According to Albert Schweitzer, the exclusion of miracle from our view of history has been universally recognized as a principle of criticism, so that miracle no longer concerns the historian either positively or negatively. The liberal Jesus seminar endorses D.F. Strauss's distinction between the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith as the first pillar of scholarly wisdom, and contend that by definition, the historical Jesus must be a non-supernatural figure. By taking this methodologically naturalistic approach, the seminar guarantees by definition that miraculous explanations are non-historical, irrespective of the evidence and irrespective of the facts. In response, I'm minded to say, well, let me introduce to you the new subject of what happened in the past studies. So on the one hand, we have the subject known as history, which is defined so that miracles are excluded from being mentioned. And on the other hand, we have this new academic subject of what happened in the past studies, where by definition, miracle claims are evaluated by examining the evidence. Sure, miracles can't be mentioned in history, but they can be mentioned in what happened in the past studies. I certainly know which of these two academic fields seems the more interesting field to study. As atheist Thomas Nagel says, a purely semantic classification of a hypothesis or its denial as belonging or not to science, or we can say to history, is of limited interest to someone who wants to know whether the hypothesis is true or false. As atheist philosopher of science Bradley Monton writes, if science, or we can say history, really is permanently committed to methodological naturalism, it follows that the aim of science or history is not generating true theories. Instead, the aim would be something like generating the best theories that can be formulated subject to the restriction that the theories are naturalistic. Science, history, is better off without being shackled by methodological naturalism. In summary, the academic Jesus of history is sometimes a Jesus of faith in philosophical constraints upon historical knowledge. But actually, there's no good reason why the so-called Christ of faith should not also be the historical Jesus if the evidence supports this conclusion. Think back to the statement with which we began. There can't be a sufficient evidential case for believing in the resurrection of Jesus because a resurrection would be a miracle. How would you respond now?